Hello and welcome to part 3 of the recording for session 3, Decolonising the Body. So in the last part I spoke about the tensions that exist between assertions of universality on the part of particular versions of feminism and the rejection of these claims of universalism by various parts of the world. And I spoke about difficulties in relation to knowledge production, but also in relation to potentially the instrumentalized use of feminism by the West and the instrumental rejection of feminism as culturally inauthentic by elites outside of the West. I think also we need to look more deeply at what might be going on when we think about the difficulties of asserting one universal version of what gender looks like and what a feminist response to that should be. So, as I said in the first part of the recording, one of the key insights that feminist thinkers have made in the field of gender has been to identify that gender is not just a social fact. It's not just that I am a woman, but in the words of the French feminist Simone de Beauvoir, I become a woman. So it's not something that we are born, feminists argue, but it's something that we are socialized into being. And there are various explanations for how that socialization happens. One particularly influential theory has been that offered by Judith Butler, who has talked about the idea of a constant performance of gender. So the ways in which I sit, I hold myself, I use my body helps to give a sense of the fixedness and naturalness of gender, when actually it is a constant performance that I am engaged in. So if we recognize that the identity of gender is not something that is fixed, but rather one that is always being produced and reproduced in different locations, then again we need to take into account the ways in which the social and historical and cultural factors will necessarily mean that there will be different ideas of what that performance should look like. And this is where it's important to go back again to thinking about both the colonial period and then the responses, particularly anti-colonial struggles that led to decolonisation in various parts of the world. So if we go back to the colonial period, while, as I said, it's been argued that there were various indigenous societies that didn't have an idea of gender binary or hierarchy based on gender, at least as we know it now, the reality is also that Western Europe at the time of the various colonial expeditions was structured around this gender order. Much the same way as we saw the binaries that we spoke about last week in relation to nature and culture, body and mind, there was also a very clear idea of a binary between man and woman and an associated hierarchy with that. So therefore, unsurprisingly, when colonizers entered different colonized societies, either because they couldn't imagine any other gender order or because they intentionally were trying to re-establish their own gender order, they operated in a way that privileged their conversations with male elites, that imposed sets of laws, social norms, policies that were about shaping ideals of what a man should be, what a woman should be, what sexual relations should be, and we'll talk more about that in next week's session. Ideals around family, which also relate to ideas of racial purity that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks' time. But there was a whole set of ideas that were reproduced in colonized societies that were aiming at replicating the same ideas about gender and gender relations as were operating within the colonial metropoles, the centres. As a result, we see, and this is something that Maladida Alwis has written quite a lot about in the context of Sri Lanka, and maybe we will talk about more examples in the session on Saturday, but what we see is, even in the post-colonial state, many ideas about what is respectable behaviour, what is modesty, what is an appropriate family structure, what is an appropriate set of ideas about reproduction, are actually in many ways a reproduction of the colonial ideas that were introduced as part of the colonial project. At the same time, in anti-colonial struggles, gender also played a very important part, and this has been well documented in various of the anti-colonial struggles. Partha Chatterjee has written about this in relation to the ideals of Hindu womanhood that were invoked by anti-colonial nationalists in India. Frantz Fanon has written about this in relation to the image of the veiled woman in Algeria coming to be a symbol of resistance to French coloniality. So we have, at the same time as a colonial set of gender norms being imposed on colonized societies, in the process of resistance to colonialism, also the use of gender, and particularly women's bodies, as kind of markers of the difference between the colonized person and the colonizer. And I think this is important history for us to bear in mind when we think about why it is that in the contemporary world, so many of the debates about cultural difference, about the difficulties of imposing universal rights frameworks, about the importance of recognizing cultural relativity, that so many of these arguments ultimately end up coming down to questions of gender and sexual norms. I don't think this is incidental. As was also mentioned in the session last week, bodies have been really important in the project of nationalism. And so if we recognise that, we also recognise that it's not just all bodies are used in the same way in nationalist imaginaries and discourses, but that those bodies are generally gendered in male and female, with the body of the woman coming to physically represent the body of the nation. We might think of Mother India. We also see the body of the woman being the marker of the community, hence why issues to do with rape in various conflict zones or during partition in India and Pakistan, why, or in the Bangladesh war, why this issue of sexual violence became so important was not just because it was the violation of women's bodies, but because it was seen as an attack on the community. And we also see particular constructions of masculinity as well. So masculinity in relation to nationalism is about being active protectors of the nation. And we can see this very clearly in, for example, the celebration of a very militarized version of masculinity in Sri Lanka, but in many other places as well. So masculinity is also drawn on as a symbol, an embodied symbol of the nation, but more often in relation to the role that the male body must play in actively protecting or governing as the citizen or the leader. And so it's important for us to recognise that maybe one of the reasons why issues of gender have been so difficult to mobilise people around is because it's not just about what it means to individual men or women, but it also reflects on ideas that we might have about community, about nation. And so it's only by thinking through how we address this question of nationalism and ideas of community and the fixedness of community that we can really get deeper into the question of gender relations and gender inequality. I want to say one last thing on this. The reason why I also mentioned men in relation to nationalism is one of the other things that has become increasingly apparent is while there have been extensive efforts to decolonize feminism by recognizing that there is not one universal experience of womanhood or one model of femininity, and while there have been various feminist movements in all sorts of parts of the world that have tried to enact their own version of a politics of gender equality, one of the things that has been paid less attention to is the issue of masculinity. And maybe that's because, as we spoke about in the last session, because there has been association of masculine with disembodiment and with the mind and rationality, it's often less obvious the ways in which masculinity is operating as not just a site of privilege in our society, but also a site of disciplining and regulation. So to take up again Foucault's idea of how power is operating, not just in oppressive ways, but also in productive ways. So if we take that up, I think one of the really interesting insights that have been made by different post-colonial scholars, one of them Raoul Rao, who you'll be hearing from next week, is that while there's been attempts to recognize different versions of femininity, that masculinity, unfortunately, remains very much controlled by an ideal of masculinity that is actually very colonial, very much built around a kind of white Western masculinity. This particular version of masculinity is used as a way of maintaining hierarchies, not just between women and men, but also between men and others who don't fit the binary. So we might want to think about that as another area that the Decolonial Project needs to take seriously, that this is issue of gender and is not just an issue of women, it's also an issue of men. And how do the models of masculinity that operate even in our anti-colonial and our anti-racist struggles, how do they often conform to ideals of masculinity that either reinforce the inferiority of non-Western men or mean that they're constantly trying to produce and perform a type of masculinity that actually has nothing to do with something that is natural or innate from within this particular context, but that is something that was actually an imposition from another part of the world as part of the project of colonization.